if I just introduce people that way? Okay.
Mark, I think you may have gotten this, but Ambassador Coots.
Hi there, folks. We're just setting up at the moment. If you bear with us, I'm talking to this.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Say that again.
They're just setting up. Ambassador Coots wasn't able to come, so Jesse is filling in for that.
Okay.
Slot.
Great.
He had a last minute conflict.
He's not on the speakers list.
Then they already must have.
And Jesse's not on the speakers list either. So shall I slot her in after Libby?
She's actually the first in our
first one in our part. Okay, great. I'll slide her in there.
Mark,
Yeah.
you quite happy with me doing the live
Oh,
session?
Francesco's joining. Good.
Oh, good.
Mark, you quite happy with me doing the live session?
And Mark, my understanding is that I'm a discussant, so if there's time, I'll make remarks at the end. If there's not, my feelings won't be heard at all. What's more important is that people hear the speakers.
Great. Thank you. I will make a note of that, and I'm going to keep the introductory remarks very short as well, so hopefully we'll get some discussion.
I mean, I'm in the third year. I did that whole song down.
Mark, you're showing up twice here.
Yeah, we're just about to start.
How weird.
Maybe someone had the same link, but they can change their name.
Me, Alejandra.
Oh, Alejandra.
Alejandro, you're using the link. Okay, good. You may want to retitle yourself so that nobody's confused or join the general link. There we go. All right, and Francesco says he's just going to listen, which is fine. All right, so the order I have of speakers is Daniela Dietz, Murray Roberts, Kate McKenzie, Mitchell Lennon, Christy McQuaid, Jesse Turner, Alexis, Libby, and then Renee as discussant.
We are ready. Hi, folks. Yeah, we'll just make a start. Sorry for the delay here. Very warm Glaswegian welcome. My name is Mitchell Lennon. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Strathclyde and associated with the One Ocean Hub. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, Exploring Law and Policy Strategies and Frameworks to Address Climate-Related Ocean Change. This event is co-sponsored by the One Ocean Hub and then the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. Okay, and without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Murray Roberts. Murray is a professor at Edinburgh University in marine biology. We'll be co-presenting with Assistant Professor Daniel Levis at Heriot Watt.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if I'm meant to use a microphone for Zoom,
I think
or
if
if I
you
should
could
just speak
Yeah,
loud.
microphone.
We've got a mic here.
I think
we can pull that together.
There's
Mitchell, are we working with slides today?
Yeah, we've got some slides. I think if you just call for a change of slides.
Perfect. So today I'm going to show you just a few pictures and talk through the issues of managing deep sea and open ocean ecosystems on a changing planet. So I'm setting the climate change context across what's most of our planet. And then Danny is going to pick up on some of the policy imperatives that lead from that. So if I could go to the next slide, please. This is the true Earth, right? Planet ocean, 70% of the planet. The areas of the ocean that we focus on in a lot of our projects are often between 3,000 and 6,000 meters water depth. Why do we do so? That's 60% of the Earth and 83% of the ocean is the abyss. Recent results that we have from August show that just 2 degrees change at those depths completely changes their ecosystem function. We see a massive doubling of respiration rate and a total loss in that, or a very significant loss in that ecosystem's potential to store carbon. If I could go to the next slide, I want to show you why the ocean is so important in the climate negotiation, why what we put into the atmosphere so much matters. The ocean overturns. Anything that we put into the sea moves globally from one place to another. These areas of deep water formation are moving the carbon dioxide we've released around the global ocean. So everything is changing. 25% of the carbon dioxide we've released has dissolved in the sea. Over 90% of heating processes have been taken up by the ocean. So the ocean is at the forefront of the climate change agenda. And if I could go to the next slide, I just summarize that alongside all the other things the ocean is suffering, the multitude of human stresses on the oceans. And if I could have the next picture, we can summarize that. The four horsemen of the ocean's apocalypse. Destructive human use. We have to get a grip on that at this point more than ever, because the implications of ocean change are transcending all national boundaries and are transcending all jurisdictions. Acidification, deoxygenation, and warming. We hear a lot about plastics in the ocean, and they are a terrible thing, but lose the oxygen in vast areas of the ocean, and simply life can't exist, and the ecosystems will shift and change. If I could go to the next slide, I'll show you just one example of destructive human use. Deepwater bottom trawling has already damaged substantial areas, and there's good work in many parts of the world to limit that. We need to see that extended. If I go to the next slide, I'll show you an animation and a couple of summaries of recent papers that show how significant global change-related issues, in this case ocean acidification, are to the functioning of deep corals. But we see a porosis in the coral skeletons, a loss of their structural integrity over time. On the right-hand side, a paper that summarizes across the global ocean how significant global change effects are on ecosystem functioning. We see one of the major concerns as being the reduced food input to vast areas of the oceans. The plankton that fuel ocean food chains are changing. We're seeing a shift from the big plankton, very nutritious plankton that sink quite quickly through the water, to smaller plankton that aren't going to get to the seafloor, that could reduce food input to the deep sea by 50%. Imagine this, 50% of that ecosystem that covers most of the planet, the food input is going to be lost. If we could go to the next slide, I want to show you very quickly some examples of what this means in terms of iconic species like deep coral distributions. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a collapse in the suitability of habitats within this next century on the basis of business as usual scenarios. If I could take the next slide, what does this mean in terms of broad brush area-based management tools that we use to conserve and manage offshore biodiversity? Everything in red and yellow becomes unsuitable under these scenarios. Only one of the area-based management tools remains suitable. This from a pan-Atlantic project that I coordinated between 2016 and 2020. And to wrap things up, if I could go to the next slide, I want to give you a couple of examples again of ocean interconnectivity. We modeled larval dispersal from deep sea habitats across this huge range of the North Atlantic Ocean. And if I could go to the next slide, I just want to bring home to you how interconnected these places are. A theoretical study of larval connectivity. If we manage things without considering that interconnectivity, we are not going to do a good job in the future in terms of ecologically coherent management. And then my last slide before I think I'm going to hand quite quickly to Danny is to queue up what Danny's going to pick up in terms of our cold water areas work plan developed for the CBD. This was something that springboarded off an ocean acidification report, which we developed in 2014 for CBD. I'll pop a few concluding remarks up, and then Danny, over to you. And you can just bring these all up onto the screen, please. I think there's a tremendous recognition now that we know what the challenges are. And at COP26, that's clear. There's a complete change in the dialogue, a complete change in the awareness that we're seeing, but we're not there yet. There are tremendous barriers, as I think we were all aware, between biodiversity and climate change policy development. Very heartening to see the workshop that took place between UNFCCC and CBD, endorsed by neither of those organizations, but at least the scientists involved around the table talking. Multidisciplinarity and science policy engagement are key. We need to scale and maintain ocean basin scale research and fundamentally build capacities, embrace diverse knowledge systems and technology transfer. It's easy to say these things, it's very hard to do them. Investment is critical. I'm delighted to be next to Libby Jewett from NOAA. Libby is a pioneer in these areas and supports basin scale and pan-Atlantic and global activities. We need more of that. I think the formulation of the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, scientific and technical body will be critical and very interesting to see that develop in the future. Thank you for your time, and Danny, please can I pass to you.
Thank you, Murray. Yeah, so if you could pop that, yeah, perfect, thank you. I'm gonna talk about picking up on Murray's points and the need for that better integration between conventions. I'll just highlight a few points of why that connectivity between international treaties already exists, and we should be applying that a little bit more. So if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so if you look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example, it already defines pollution and marine pollution as including atmospheric pollution that goes into the ocean. So the definition already, it allows for that incorporation of CO2 sinking to the oceans. Go to the next slide, please. We can see a number of obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention that not only that relates to climate change and ocean acidification as well, picking up from the definition of marine pollution, that's very broad definition. All parties have an obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment, and also they have an obligation to take jointly or individually all measures necessary to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from any source. And also picking up on Murray's point about area-based management tools and the importance of those, there is a specific Article 194, paragraph 5, that talks about the measures that need to be included in those set of measures to protect the marine environment, which include area-based management measures. Go to the next slide, please. So other provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea include EIA obligations, so environmental impact assessments, and also the obligation to prevent and reduce control pollution from all sources, again, including from atmospheric sources. So next slide, please. So if then we look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and also the Paris Agreement, we see that oceans is already reflected in the text of those two treaties. The first one from 1992, UNFCCC, Article 4, talks about the need to promote the sustainable management and promote and cooperation in the conservation and enhancement as appropriate of sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, and talks specifically about marine ecosystems and the oceans in that respect. And we see that being more prominent, being discussed at UNFCCC space through the ocean and climate change dialogue that has been taking place. And we hope that it will continue, but also beyond the continuation of those global dialogues, I think that it's really important to mainstream those that integration into the agenda items of the COPs. So if we go to the next slide, please. The Paris Agreement, of course, the preambular paragraph of the Paris Agreement acknowledges the role of the oceans and the protection of biodiversity as an important component of the achievement of the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And also one thing that I don't have that in that slide is Article 5 of the Paris Agreement refers back, has a cross-reference to that Article 4 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that I just talked about. So a cross-reference to that obligation, again, or to that commitment, if you will, around protection of carbon sinks in the marine environment. So how to do that? One of the areas that I've been looking very closely is how to look into what other conventions have been done and guidance that have been produced under other conventions. If we go to the next slide, please. So for example, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity that Murray talked about, has already initiated those discussions. So back in 2010, parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Aichi biodiversity targets, which expired in 2020. One target specifically that was due in 2015 because of the urgency of the matter was around this commitment to reduce multiple anthropogenic pressures on coral reefs and other vulnerable ecosystems impacted by climate change and ocean acidification, and to minimize those anthropogenic effects, and also in a cumulative manner. And to implement that, a number of tools and guidance have been developed. There is one specifically developed around coral reefs, which is this priority action plan. And then if we go to the next slide, please, That's the work plan that Murray was talking about, so that his work on ocean acidification and also in cold water areas, which is just 200 meters below the surface. So you don't need to go too deep to already encounter those areas that are particularly vulnerable to climate change and ocean acidification. And the convention, the Conference of the Parties of the CBD, COP13, adopted that voluntary specific work plan on biodiversity in cold water areas within the jurisdictional scope of the convention. That's a funny story. One of the parties asked to add that within the jurisdictional scope of the convention to the title, thinking of Article 4 of the CBD, which and for some restricts its application to areas beyond national jurisdiction. It actually, the party wanted to have in the title that it would only be applicable to areas within national jurisdiction, but another party was very clever and suggested within the jurisdictional scope of the convention, because Article 4 of the CBD allows for the application of the convention in areas beyond national jurisdiction with respect to activities and processes. So the management would be allowed in that regard. But the important thing is that the context, the content of this plan is based on that best available science. If we go to the next slide, please. A number of recommendations have been included in that work plan that I think would be very well, welcomed in the context of the NDCs, for example. So that's one area that I think the better integration between the CBD and UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement could make a little bit more leeway and contribute to the oceans, the conservation, sustainable use of the oceans, and the and also the achievement of the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal. Go to the next slide, please, or maybe the next one. And now the CBGs were negotiating, and they are going to adopt, hopefully in April next year in China at COP15. It's post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and of course it got delayed because of the COVID pandemic, and that will replace those Aichi biodiversity targets. So target 10 that we discussed before will be replaced, and the closest one that we have at the moment, which is still in draft form, is target 8. But it doesn't refer to ocean acidification specifically, and doesn't provide yet the indicators being developed, and we need science to inform those indicators. We need science to inform what would be meaningful in terms of ocean acidification. And we still have SDG 14.3 that talks about ocean acidification, but no specific thresholds for that. So my conclusions in the last slide, please. We need to protect and minimize cumulative anthropogenic impacts on blue carbon ecosystems that could provide also stacked services and maximize benefits for humans. So that should be achieved through that better integration across conventions. There is a need for standardization and metrics across indicators, and I think the opportunity is there for that cross-fertilization across conventions and indicators that are being developed across different bodies and fora. There's also the need to expand metrics around blue carbon ecosystems, because IPCC has guidance on mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses, but there's no other guidance available at the global level from IPCC to be applicable to NDCs, for example, in terms of other marine ecosystems that could play that role, important carbon sink role as well, and other conclusions that I'll stop because I'm running out of time, but we need to basically strengthen those mechanisms for cooperation based on best available science. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny and Murray, for that. Swiftly moving on, their next presentation is Exploring States' Obligations to Mitigate Climate Change in Their Deep Sea Activities, Exploration and Conservation. So my dear friend, Kate McKenzie. Kate is a PhD researcher also at Strathclyde University, Managing Editor of Carbon Climate Law Review, and a Senior Researcher at the Climate Change Litigation Initiative, but in her capacity here, the PhD student. We've also got Kirsty McCabe, who's joining us online from South Africa. Kirsty is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Plymouth and affiliated with the South African National Biodiversity Institute. And then there's me as well. I introduced myself earlier. So Kirsty's going to start, and she's just joining us online. So Kirsty.
have Christy.
Yep. Hi, can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool, brilliant, great. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I'm just going to take you, if you can pass to the next slide, through a brief introduction just to the deep sea to set the scene for the discussion that Kate and Mitch will then take on. So the deep sea is defined as any part of the ocean that's deeper than 200 meters. It makes up approximately 97% of the volume of the ocean. So it's a really vast environment. It's home to a range of different habitats like undersea mountains, called seamounts, steep canyons, huge abyssal plain areas. And it also supports a really vast array of marine life, both on the seafloor and in the water column. Next slide, please. So the deep sea is also increasingly recognized as a vital component of our planet. And as Murray just greatly explained, it provides many different ecosystem services that promote and support human well-being, so regulating, provisioning, supporting cultural services. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll focus on the carbon regulation role of the deep ocean, which essentially centers around carbon cycling and carbon sequestration. And this is a regulating and a service supporting service identified through ecosystem services frameworks. So briefly, carbon dioxide, I'm sure you all know, in the atmosphere is dissolved into the surface waters in the upper ocean. It's then transported to depth through global ocean circulation patterns. And this is also the case for another important greenhouse gas called methane, but here we're focused on carbon. And so in addition, which you can see on the figure here, carbon cycling occurs, which is the sinking and the accumulation of carbon in marine organisms from surface waters to depth. And then some of this carbon is then sequestered and stored in sediments, in deep sea sediments, either through kind of passive burial as the sediment particles go to the seafloor, or through active bioturbation, where the organisms on the seafloor bury and tunnel and store it in that way. And the carbon is then locked away for thousands to millions of years. So in this way, the deep ocean plays a really important role in regulating climate, but also mitigating climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then storing it at depth. Next slide, please. So scientists can then measure and map these blue carbon stocks to understand both how much the deep ocean is contributing to carbon storage and also which areas might be important for this. So here you can see an example of this where we show storage of organic carbon in sediments on a global scale and then also on a finer scale on the UK continental margin. And researchers have found that although rates of carbon sequestration in these deep sea sediments are much lower than shallower water habitats that have generally been discussed, like seagrasses and salt marshes and mangroves and things like that, these environments play a really important role in storing carbon because they cover such vast areas. So next slide, please. And so my final slide is just talking about the ability of the deep ocean and its ability to continue performing this vital climate regulation role, and how it's affected both by climate change and by global warming itself, but also by a number of different human activities that cause disturbance to deep sea ecosystems. And so when we talk about the deep sea floor, specifically, the key activities of concern are fishing and specifically trawling, oil and gas extraction, seabed mining, which isn't yet occurring, but appears to be imminent. And so recent research has shown that trawling disturbance to the seafloor can release stored sediment from the sediments, stored carbon, in the sediments back into the water column. And there's concern that this could also happen with mining, particularly in the shallower waters that are targeted for minerals like phosphate rather than the very deep waters. But so these activities have the potential to not only release these deep carbon stocks, but also to limit the ability of these deep ecosystems to function as they normally would. And so together with other pressures can cumulatively act to impair the deep ocean's ability to continue providing these vital climate regulation services. And I'll now pass over to Kate and Mitchell, who will discuss some of the legal implications of this and explore questions around stakes obligations based on this.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. Can we, oh, perfect, next slide is up.
I find it incredibly useful to have a visual picture that is created by a scientist to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the sort of legalities about this kind of activity. So one of the major questions that we're looking at today is the question of sort of, does the law of the Sea Convention, or could the law of the Sea Convention bolster states' obligations under the climate change regime as it pertains to their ocean-related and particularly deep sea activities? We already talked about regime interactions between the climate change regime and the CBD, and so now, of course, we're also looking at regime interactions between the climate change regime and the law of the Sea Convention. But to get to the question of whether the law of the sea bolsters states' obligations under the climate regime, first we have to look at what are states' obligations under the climate regime as it pertains to deep sea activities in the ocean. Do they have any, right? That's the big question. Danny already mentioned a couple of the specific mentions of the ocean in the climate regime. But specifically, let's look at the obligations that states have under the Paris Agreement, for example. It's pretty well understood, of course, that those actually specifically legally binding obligations that states have under the Paris Agreement are procedural in nature, right? Specifically, any obligations of result that the parties have under the Paris Agreement are procedural in nature, right? We have in Article 4.2, parties have to prepare, communicate, maintain their NDCs. Article 4.8 requires the provision of information necessary to understand clarity. Article 4.9, there's the requirement to communicate those NDCs. 4.13, you have to account for those NDCs. So all of these actual obligations that states have are around communicating and informing, right? They're all very procedural obligations. There's one other article that I want to mention that I will come back to at the end, just because it's sort of a beginning question that we're sort of like playing around with and thinking about in a more meaningful way now, and that's Article 13.7 or subsection 7, which requires states to regularly provide information on emissions by sources and removals by sinks, and also information necessary to track the progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs. And this brings up a question when we're talking about deep sea activities, as Kirsty was talking about, the waking up essentially of sequestered carbon, and does that ultimately potentially trigger a requirement for states to then list that release of carbon in their NDCs? That's not something we'll get into in depth, but it's an interesting question. So essentially, all these obligations require states to communicate and provide information on their NDCs. But where is the ocean in this? Danny specifically already mentioned Article 5.1 of the Paris Agreement, where it just states parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases as referred to in Article 4, paragraph 1, subsection D of the convention, which Danny also kindly mentioned earlier. I like it, which again, it just provides that parties have to promote sustainable management, promote and cooperate in the conservation and enhancement, again, as appropriate, of sinks and reservoirs. So essentially, the only real operative articles in the climate regime about the ocean tell parties that they should take action, to conserve and enhance as appropriate of sinks and reservoirs. So it's really just the promotion of enhancement and conservation of these sinks. And really, this also shows us that the climate regime, really on paper, I mean, there are, as you mentioned, there's progress being made to bring the ocean and the climate regime closer, but really the ocean is seen as a sink in the climate regime. And so one thing I want to mention before I pass on to Mitchell is that because the Paris Agreement essentially is built just on this ambition, right? The temperature goal is an ambition. There's progression in the Paris Agreement. Every 5 years, we have a new NDC in the stock take. It's based on the making of best efforts, the using of best available science. All of this is due diligence language. So aside from the very limited number of specific legally binding procedural obligations under the Paris Agreement, the entire thing is really based on due diligence. So I think personally, it requires a deeper look into what is due diligence. What does due diligence mean specifically in the climate regime? and then also in the context of the oceans. And so since we are talking about the oceans, I'm going to let Mitchell talk a little bit more specifically about the Law of the Sea and the Law of the Sea Convention.
The Law of the Seabed. Okay, what is that? If we look at our Part 11 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we'll find that the international seabed area, okay, the area beyond national jurisdiction, all the rights and the resources of the area are vested in mankind as a whole. Again, dated language here, on whose behalf the International Seabed Authority shall act. Okay, so we understand that the area and its resources, okay, are the common heritage of humankind. Okay, the common heritage of humankind is kind of characteristics of extraterritoriality, sharing, and legality as well. Okay, any exploration of resources on the seabed must be done with protection and preservation of the marine environment in mind. Okay, you find that in Part 12 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and Danny's already alluded to that earlier. And that's informed by generally agreed international rules and standards. Okay, so you'll find those, say, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity and also in the Paris Agreement as well. Okay, Part 11 of UNCLOS created kind of two institutions that are relevant here. Okay, the first one is the International Seabed Authority. Okay, its role here is to kind of organize, regulate, and control resource activities in the area. And then the second one is the Seabed Disputes Chamber. Okay, that has a seat in Hamburg at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and it has both contentious and advisory jurisdiction. Okay, and so we're going to move on to the next slide. We'll discuss the advisory jurisdiction of the Seabed Disputes Chamber. Okay, so in 2010, the International Seabed Authority requested the Seabed Disputes Chamber for an advisory opinion. Okay, it was formulated as a set of three kind of key questions, and then both based on kind of legal responsibilities, okay, liability, and then necessary and appropriate measures to fulfill that responsibility. Okay. And then in answering these questions, the Seabed Disputes Chamber identified the kind of exact content of primary obligations of sponsoring states conducting activities in the area. Okay, and the benefit of the advisory opinion, despite the fact that it's not legally binding, it carries considerable legal weight. It's made with the same rigor as a contentious judgment. Okay, and it clarifies and illustrates most, I think, of the issues that and most of the issues in areas with regards to activities in the area. But as you might be unsurprised to hear, it doesn't actually say anything about climate change or its impacts. Okay, but what it did highlight is the customary nature of the obligation to conduct an environmental impact assessment. Okay, and then shed light on the general obligation to apply due diligence, and then I'll pass that over to Kate to discuss next. Next slide, please.
So due diligence. Due diligence has several factors, and these are really developed these are really developed in international law in international environmental law, and then particularly through the Seabed advisory opinion and ITLOS and the Law of the Sea. And so in broad terms, due diligence has essentially these sort of 6 factors. There's a determination of a risk of harm. It requires flexibility. Due diligence is an objective standard. It is a continuous obligation, so it's not just a one and done. It requires a state to have some level of knowledge of what's going on and use the best available knowledge to them. There's a responsibility there. And it also, due diligence, any actions taken must be reasonable. So in the climate regime, we see risk of harm, check. Like there's harm, there's risk of harm, we get it, that's not a question. Flexibility we see in the climate regime through differentiation, right? So we see the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in national circumstances. That is that flexibility that due diligence requires. Article 4.2, the second sentence of Article 4.2 really establishes a standard of conduct, a really objective standard of conduct that parties need to do as well as they can in designing, implementing, and enforcing their domestic measures. It's the continuous obligation of due diligence is found in the climate regime. We see the 5-year NDC, the ratcheting up, the global stock take. That is that continuous obligation we see there. The Paris Agreement requires highest possible ambition, use of best available scientific knowledge. So that's there as well. And reasonability is in there that we see just in the precautionary approach and the global stock take. So all of the various elements of due diligence are in the climate regime. But again, we are talking about the ocean. So since the climate regime doesn't give us anything specific when it comes to the ocean, and is just sort of couched in due diligence, I'll pass it back over to Mitchell.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so just next slide, please. And just quickly, as we're kind of running out of time. Yeah, essentially, with the Seabed Advisory Opinion, this tells us that we need the precautionary approach and due diligence, and the obligations essentially apply regardless of sovereignty. Okay, so this applies both in the international seabed area, okay, and then also in national jurisdiction. And then if you skip to the question.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. Yeah. Do you want to do this together, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, yeah, okay. So again, just to wrap up, the seabed is a carbon sink. It plays a huge role in climate regulation. States have several obligations and activities that affect the seabed, both within and beyond national jurisdiction. Okay, as Kate's explained, due diligence is the kind of key and overarching concept that connects the climate and the law of the sea obligations. Okay, and we understand due diligence well. Okay, we understand in international law and public and private law. And our kind of final, I guess, our final question or discussion point really is that, you know, states have to consider their climate obligations in their seabed activities, okay? And so if you have an obligation to do an environmental impact assessment, is the seabed, you need to check, is the seabed a carbon sink? Is that activity going to release CO2? And then include that in your NDC.
Right. Does the release of that carbon because of the activities you're doing trigger an obligation to include that in the NDCs? It's, I think, an open question at this point. That's us.
That's us. Thank you very much. Mark, I'm wondering if I can hand over to you to chair the online part of this, or?
Super. Thank you very much, and thank you for those interventions. We're very, very pleased to be here today. My name is Mark Spalding. I'm the president of the Ocean Foundation. I regret that my co-chair for the portion of this panel, Francesco Sindico, has contracted COVID-19 while attending COP26 and is therefore not in the room as planned. He asked me to chair without him today, and so we're going to do our best, especially as he is online listening. We're very pleased to co-host this panel on exploring law and policy strategies and frameworks to address climate-related ocean change, together with One Ocean Hub and the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. Just briefly, the Ocean Foundation is an international community foundation based in Washington, D.C. and established in 2003. We host and support more than 50 projects and have grantees in 40 countries on 6 continents. I wanted to just frame a bit of welcome before introducing our set of lineup of speakers and remind us that we're talking here a little bit about, you know, sort of 3 phases of understanding of the climate ocean nexus. You know, what is the ocean going to do to us is number 1. What are we doing to the ocean is number 2. And number 3 is the ocean as our ally to combat climate change and ocean acidification. You know, in the first instance, we know that the ocean is going to do things to us as a result of sea level rise, severe storms, ocean acidification, and those things are going to damage human infrastructure, fisheries, etc. And this triggers law and governance related to managed retreat, risk management and insurance law, human rights laws and climate justice, cultural heritage protection laws, tort and other claims against oil companies and other likely defendants. In phase 2 of the understanding of what we're doing to the ocean, those same warmer waters, changes in currents, shifting habitat and species, deoxygenation, and ocean acidification are going to trigger looking at laws related to the cumulative threats. What can we do to reduce chemistry change in the ocean from things like fertilizer runoff so as to not to make ocean acidification worse? How are we going to look at addressing fishing rights regarding shifting fishing populations? But we also want to make sure we're talking about the ocean as our ally. And you know, we know, of course, that it is the planet's heat sink and it's our biggest carbon sink. And so we need to make sure that this triggers looking at the laws to protect and restore blue carbon resources such as seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marsh estuaries. But on the flip side, we also want to make sure that the ocean is not put at risk of unintended consequences of geoengineering or other technology that could consequences that could come, not necessarily will come, but could come from other non-nature-based solutions. So let me turn to our group of speakers and ask Jesse Turner, who I think is there in the room, to begin.
No, do you want to talk? Just sit here.
It's okay. I'm actually just going to be super quick because I know we're running short on time. So thanks, Mark, if you can hear that, or if you can hear me. And we covered those first set of presentations were hefty and it covered a lot. So I'm still like digesting, and some of my slides are repetitive. So we're not going to do that because that doesn't matter. I mean, that definitely matters. So I'm just going to introduce, I think, sort of what we're going to dive into that has a little bit more of an applicable, what governments are doing now currently to address ocean acidification, both within some of these international frameworks, but at a domestic level, at national level, and then at a local level. So my name is Jesse Turner. I'm the director of an initiative called the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And the one slide I'm wondering if we can pull up is just one from the deck, and it has people standing behind a sign that says COP26, and they look very dedicated to the ocean. And so if there's that slide that we can bring up, that would be awesome. But what I really just wanted to dive into, we talked about some of the frameworks internationally for thinking about addressing ocean climate change broadly and ocean acidification specifically. The NDCs through the UNFCCC, which hosted the dialogue just last year, and really focusing on, how we include adaptation, mitigation, and vulnerability assessments and financing really across the UNFCCC to think about the ocean climate nexus is a big piece of the puzzle. We talked a little bit about CBD. We talked about, the UN Sustainable Development Goal 14.3. And then we also introduced, I think, a little bit the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which is what Libby's going to dive into. But this slide right here, I just want to bring to your guys' attention. So this is a photo taken from October 31st at the University of Edinburgh, where a group called the Because the Ocean Declaration hosted a signing of the third iteration of Because the Ocean Declaration. And that's a picture of about 12, 13 governments standing up there committing to ocean inclusion, particularly, and we call them ocean enhanced NDCs. And it has a whole charter and you can go check it out. But I just want to root us in the context that here at COP, and really beginning several COPs prior, there is this growing chorus of ocean actors, both national government and civil society, and in our case, sub-national governments even, really trying to bring this to bear in real life. So just as a note, our initiative, the Ocean Acidification Alliance, does include national and state actors, as well as local and city. We're trying to do two things. One is to support efforts like this, where we're really bringing ocean into the international legal and governance frameworks, but also want to make sure that we're talking about the domestic level, because as you all heard, oh my gosh, ocean and coastal acidification is a crazy hard thing to get your arms around. And while we need to reduce carbon emissions, the #1 cause of ocean acidification, we also need to think about local and domestic facing activities, particularly targeted science that's going to be useful for response strategies on the ground. So that's sort of what our next two speakers are going to talk about a little bit, both from our partner Ocean Foundation and how they've been working to capacity build and really think about helping communities and nations build the types of monitoring information that then gets fed into some sort of policy stream at a local or international level. And then Dr. Libby Jewett, who's going to talk about ocean acidification policy in the United States, which has been quite advanced. I think the US is the only government that has a dedicated ocean acidification program that is funded in the millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. And then talk a little bit about how ocean acidification is showing up in the Decade of Ocean Science. So that's all I wanted to say, and just sort of putting it in context that this is all very real and happening right now, and we'll see what kind of ocean outcomes we get from this COP, but certainly the struggle continues, and many frameworks and many angles to think about how we account for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, financing. So Alexis, over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. I do have some slides that I think are going to be pulled up here, and I'm trying to kind of fit things, I guess, in a bit of a storytelling framework. So the Ocean Foundation, Marcus introduced it well. I'm going to talk about the work I do leading our International Ocean Acidification Initiative, and a lot of that focuses on kind of strengthening the feedback loop between science and policy and thinking about how do we enable science-based ocean acidification action. So if you can go to the next slide, please. One of the ways that we've done this is advising governments at all levels on the types of policy actions that are available and sort of the utility of these different types of actions. We've drafted legislation that's been passed at the subnational level and at the regional level, as well as working on some national legislation. But what we did with this guidebook is we did sort of a catalog of existing frameworks, whether they be many of what you've heard already, UNCLOS, CED, these types of things, or subnational legislation. That's a really great model for how you address this type of issue. We kind of annotate the types of legislation and policy measures that exist and explain the use cases of those, and then provide a link to the actual language in those pieces of policy to provide, in a sense, template or inspiration. So this is a toolkit that we prepared in early 2020 and 2019. We're updating it frequently, and we use it a lot in helping governments come up with their own strategies. An example, if you go to the next slide, of something that we have, directly been involved in getting approved in terms of the policy realm is through the Cartagena Convention, which is a legally binding convention in the wider Caribbean region. We, through the Scientific Technical Advisory Committee, sort of engaged with them and expressed that we thought regional cooperation and coordination on ocean acidification would be beneficial, that it was an issue that should be recognized and incorporated into ocean management and climate strategies. And they agreed and made recommendations to the Conference of the Parties. And in the 2019 Conference of the Parties, they passed this resolution that really, in many ways, authorizes a lot of governments to include ocean acidification in their national ocean programs, and has really unlocked a lot of partners, who want to be engaged on this, and they sort of feel like they have the authority to do so now. Next slide, please. So how do we make sure that the policy is, science-based and really informed by science? We really rely on the experts in each country. And I want to tell a story about a partner we work with in Mexico. Dr. Jose Martin Hernandez Leon is the leading ocean acidification scientist in Mexico, and we have brought him in to speak with the Senate and with various executive bodies to basically share the body of work that he and his research community have done and sort of make recommendations as to how the government should approach this. I caught up with him about a year ago, asking him about his experience. He said, in 2008, he published a paper in Science that was all about ocean acidification, California current, and he thought, wow, I've done it, right? I have published in the most well-respected journal. Now the policymakers in Mexico, Mexico's going to see that this is an issue that should be, addressed and thought of in terms of national ocean strategy. But his phone didn't ring. Nobody called. And then, 11 years later, we brought him to speak to the Senate Commission on Natural Resources, Climate Change, and he was able to speak directly with senators. And since then, there's just been this sort of snowballing effect where we've kind of put him in touch with different ministries or different, executive offices or legislative offices. And now there's a national ocean acidification strategy being taken up by the Ministry of Environment. And so he was reflecting on it that, it wasn't until in 2019 when he went in front of the Senate that anyone cared. And so he said this when I interviewed him, we need to do something more than just publish in a good journal. To reach the policymakers in the community, we need to pursue different channels. And something that we try and do as the Ocean Foundation is kind of help identify some of those channels and also help scientists who often feel very uncomfortable speaking to policymakers because they really don't want to compromise their integrity as a scientist, understand how they can, maintain that integrity and just really express their understanding of the issue and the gaps and the kind of resource needs. Next slide, please. So that's a wonderful example of someone who was an advanced researcher, really a leader in his government. We brought him to the Senate. We've been able to get some real policy action put forward in Mexico. A lot of my work focuses on helping scientists establish the very first ocean acidification programs in their countries. And so in many cases, there's no monitoring, there hasn't been sort of this ocean carbon nexus incorporated into the scientific community, let alone the policy world. So one of the ways that I try to think about, okay, well, how can we make the science policy feedback loop sort of built in to this, community from the get-go, is having interdisciplinarity kind of built into all the capacity development we do. So these photos here are from a workshop in Colombia in 2019, where we had policymakers and scientists, and we had this very integrated approach. For example, on the left-hand side, you see it's actually Martin who's pointing his finger up. There's actually a group of policymakers, including a minister of environment, and they're in a science lab, kind of seeing what are the pieces of equipment that are used to measure this issue, and what's the complexity here, what's the maintenance like. Then we have on the right-hand side a group of participants in a scallop hatchery learning about sort of how this issue plays out in industry settings, and kind of how science and policy and industry can work together to advance solutions. And in the middle, there's a sort of a priority setting session where we had scientists think about, well, what policy changes would they like to see? For example, improving the ability of them to import scientific equipment and be able to get access to the equipment they need. And so having the interdisciplinary approach in all of our capacity development is something we do across the board now. One of the programs that's newer that we're working on is in the Gulf of Guinea. And in this case, a scientist approached us and said, I'm working on a regional project where we're trying to have intercomparability with our methods and really strengthen our understanding of what's happening with ocean acidification in the Gulf of Guinea. We were able to put forward some funding for equipment, but as I talked to her and her partners in the 5 countries that she's working with, became clear that they really also wanted their governments to be much more engaged. And so what we're doing in this project is very much in its infancy, is each country has a focal point for this project, and they're tasked with kind of assessing the government bodies that should be engaged in this issue, the various laws that might already exist, or things that intersect with ocean acidification, and bringing relevant people into different aspects of our training program, bringing them in to co-design the monitoring programs from the start. And so this is just another example of how we try to, build that interdisciplinarity into things from the beginning. And with that, I believe that's my final slide. And so thank you very much. And now I want to hand it off to one of our great partners, Dr. Libby Jewett.
All right, and I think we have a few minutes. Okay, and I have no slides, so this will be quick. So my name is Libby Jewett, and I am from the U.S. government. I'm in charge, as Murray pointed out, of the Ocean Acidification Program in NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm also chair of which I'll allude to later, an interagency committee where I work with other agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Science Foundation and NASA and the Park Service to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction on ocean acidification. And today I just briefly want to talk about the interconnection of legislation, policy, science, and action, because I feel like we need all of those. And we have a pretty interesting case study in the US. So we've all heard how bad OA is and how we need to work on it. In the US in 2009, we passed a law, an ocean acidification law, with the nice acronym 4AM, which is actually a tiny shell building organism for those of you who might be ocean scientists, so that we kind of played on that. It's the Federal OA Research and Monitoring Act. That has been critical for enabling funding, long-term, permanent funding. So this is not National Science Foundation funding something for 3 years. This is like forever, hopefully, you know, assuming Congress appropriates that money, and they have been, and our funding has actually been going up almost every year since we started. That funding enables science. And so, and enables science, which then informs policy, which can then maybe lead to other legislation or to lead to, you know, other kinds of climate action. So funding in the US has enabled our creation of science, funding of science that's important for assessments. And of course, you've all been hearing about the IPCC. They just came out with the Working Group 1 report. We have scientists that we funded and that information is in that Working Group 1 report. You have to have that because that then informs the COP and all the decisions that are being made there. I was actually a lead author on Working Group 2, which is going to be coming out. That's the impact side will be coming out in a few months. So we have the assessments. We also have our own national climate assessments in the US. So that's happening. We are able to enable capacity building around the world, and the work that Alexis was just talking about is enabled through NOAA interaction and money from our State Department. Also another group that's involved with our interagency. So that's amazing, and that then provides information that's important for the Sustainable Development Goal 14.3 data. Again, there's data underlying there coming from countries, which is then hopefully enabling policy, which is what Alexis was talking about. We also are having conversations about carbon dioxide removal. What are we going to do to mitigate climate change? But we also want to make sure that if we're going to be moving in that pathway, that we're making sure we're doing no harm. And so having the science is informing, like we don't want ocean acidification to become worse in the meantime while we're actually trying to do the right thing. So we gotta have that intersection happening. And then we are enabled, are capable because of the funding that we have to enable the creation of international networks and leadership of international networks. And one of the ones that I helped co-found was the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, which now we started with about 120 scientists and about 20 countries. And now we have over 100 countries and almost 1,000 scientists. So it's just that conversation that can happen there is also important for all of those things that we just talked about and for informing the delegates who are here for the COP. And then I'll just touch lastly, there's something called the UN Decade for Ocean Science, which is happening now. It's kicked off this year. That's being led by the international or the Intergovernmental Commission, IOC. And one of the programs in there is called OARS, OARS, OA Research for Sustainability. Again, just a great opportunity for us to a heightened attention about ocean acidification, talk about action, talk about communication of science, you know, make sure that more and more people know about the work that we're doing, both through the Global OA Observing Network, but in addition, our work with the Oxygen Network and the Biodiversity Network. We've heard about CBD. So it just, you know, it focuses attention on that and make sure that we, you know, keep to our goals, which is very exciting, and hopefully leverages and brings in additional funding. We'll see. So I think I'm going to end there unless there's something else that, okay, we're good. Or questions I have.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
okay, well, yeah, I think I'm conscious that we're kind of running out of time, but
Yeah.
I'm conscious that we started 10 minutes late. Okay, so I think if anyone wants to leave for lunch, please feel free. I won't judge you. I will. Okay, I'm just going to do a bit of online bias because I think we've got one question online.
Our moderators of it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Where, so there's no question online. Oh, there is. Yeah. Me too. Okay.
Oh, you can read it.
Oh, yeah, I'm looking that way. To anyone on the panel, okay, I guess that includes me. What do you see as a successful COP26 plan of action to restore the health of our ocean that would go hand in hand with the proposed post-2020 global biodiversity framework? Danny,
Sure. Yeah, I think that, you know, for me at least, I think that one thing that has been on the agenda for both the COP26 and also has triggered a lot of discussions and negotiations of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is this concept of nature-based solutions. And we heard from Mark and we heard from others in terms of blue carbon ecosystems. And of course, nature-based solutions is not only with respect to oceans, but also terrestrial ecosystems. But I think, you know, for me, I think it's an important element that should play a role in COP26 for sure. And I think that's also some important parameters that should be brought together with it. If it's going to succeed, if it's going to be part of a COP decision or anything like that, it would be really good to also set those type of parameters that they're not, for example, not a replacement for mitigation measures, so carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions reductions, for example, that it needs to respect, you know, shouldn't undermine the livelihoods of people and the communities that depend on those ecosystems. And at the same time, it shouldn't cause any harm to biodiversity or to marine biodiversity. So I think some of those parameters would be important to give some comfort to some groups that are nervous about the term, because, for example, that term actually was part of the draft article target 7 of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and now it's been removed from that, which became the target 8 that I talked about, and that, so that term is a little bit controversial, but I think it's a very important issue with the right parameters around it. It's a very important issue to be part of the agenda and the discussions. And I think that one thing that I mentioned, you know, mainstreaming that connectivity between those policy coherence basically across those different conventions should be part of this COP26 and part of all the different agenda items, and oceans should have a high profile across those agenda items and not just in the periphery of the negotiation. So being an essential part of that, so that the NDCs, and we've seen some very important experiences that actually some of those lessons learned are already being incorporated into the NDCs, and that's an important element of that as well. So yeah, and for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, it's vice versa. I think having that you know, synergy with what's being decided here around those topics, it's also very important to accomplish all those goals.
Excellent answer, Danny. Fantastic. Is anyone else on the panel, both in person and online, want to chip into this question at all before I move on?
Just a really quick one,
Yeah.
Mitchell. So the focus on blue carbon ecosystems is really, really interesting, and it's very, very important. But there are some risks. If we only focus on one aspect of what an ecosystem provides us, there is, you know, a risk we might ignore other ecosystems because they're not such great blue carbon stores, or they might even be producing carbon. Now, that would be disastrous. We've got to manage biodiversity. We've got to secure diversity, really for its own intrinsic value and importance. And I think it's fascinating when we hear discussions of deep sea mining, we hear discussions of potential significant loss of carbon potential in those areas. Well, I'm very interested in that. I'm almost more interested in the loss of diversity, diversity that we don't yet understand. So it's keeping that in mind and really being back for biodiversity. And it's wonderful that we're not only in the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, but a UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. But we mustn't just restore ecosystems because of blue carbon. It's because they're wonderful. It's because they're diverse. It's because they're part of, our heritage in humanity and for the rest of life on Earth.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just conscious, I wanted to actually turn to one of our discussants, Renee Martin-Nagle. Renee wasn't able to make it today, and I just wondered if she's got anything to add, kind of based on the panel.
Yes, please. Thank you. Renee.
Thank you, Mitch. And thank you, Mark. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say much at all, but what I will say is that this discussion has highlighted the fact that ocean governance is very fragmented and that there's a lack of substantive obligations. And I hope that at some point we will be able to all come together in an effort to find serious obligations that nations are willing to undertake, and individuals as well. And let's not forget industry, in order to protect the ocean that really protects all of us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Those are fantastic closing remarks. Now, just in the interest of time, I think we should maybe move on to lunch break, but we will be around all day if you have any questions for us and further discussions. I hope we thank you very much for coming. Go around for the online panel. Thank you very much. All right.